All right, so we're diving deep into autism today. And wow, you've given us a lot to work with.
Yeah, there's a lot here.
Yeah, we've got everything from personal blogs to like medical journals, even a guide from Cheap ABA about the 3 levels of autism.
Sounds like a good mix.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say you probably already know the basics,
Yeah.
right? So today we're kind of going beyond those labels, trying to understand, what it's really like to live on the spectrum.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's key. We need to move past this idea that autism is just this one size fits all kind of experience.
Right.
What we're going to be looking at today is just how differently it can manifest for different people.
And I was reading this one blog post. It really surprised me.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the author was talking about how their fear of escalators wasn't just some random quirk. It was like directly related to their autism and how they process sensory information.
Oh, wow.
And I'd never even considered that before.
It's a great example of how, something that might seem so small to one person can be a really big deal for someone on the spectrum.
Yeah.
And it really highlights why I think the term spectrum is so important.
Right.
Because we're not talking about a straight line from like mild to severe, but rather like a huge range of different experiences.
Okay, so I get the spectrum analogy,
Yeah.
but the DSM-5 still uses those 3 levels, right?
Right.
So how does that fit in with this idea of, moving beyond labels?
Well, I think the levels are helpful as like a framework,
Okay.
a starting point for kind of understanding support needs, but they can also be kind of misleading.
Really?
Yeah. One of the sources you gave me actually compared it to like trying to categorize all music
Mm-hmm.
just based on volume, like loud, louder, loudest.
Okay.
And it totally ignores all the nuances of genre, melody, rhythm.
Yeah, I like that. Totally misses the point.
Exactly.
Wow, it's such a good analogy.
Thanks.
So I guess those levels, like the level 1, 2, and 3, they're really just like the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to it.
Yeah, and one thing that I think makes it even more complicated is this idea of masking, which I know several of your sources touch on.
Masking. What is that?
So masking is basically, well, imagine feeling like you have to constantly perform, like you have to hide your true self in order to just fit in.
Oh, wow.
For some people on the spectrum, that's just everyday life.
Really?
Yeah, they might force themselves to make eye contact even though it's uncomfortable, or they might try to suppress their stimming behaviors, those repetitive movements or sounds that can be really helpful for them.
Wow. So why go through all that effort to mask?
Well, I mean, for a lot of people, it's about survival.
Oh.
A lot of autistic people have had really negative reactions or judgments when they've tried to be themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So masking becomes a way to avoid those social consequences.
Right.
But it comes at a cost.
Hmm.
It can be really emotionally exhausting to constantly be trying to be someone you're not.
Yeah, that's got to be really hard.
Yeah, and it can also make it even harder for people to get a diagnosis.
Oh, right, because they're hiding their true selves.
Exactly. Someone who's really good at masking might seem like they're functioning at a much higher level than they actually are.
Wow, and I bet that's especially true for women on the spectrum.
It is, yeah. And actually, a lot of the sources you gave me brought that up.
Oh, good. I'm glad because I was really interested in that. We hear about autism all the time, but it seems like we're only starting to understand how differently it can present in women.
Yeah, and there's still so much we don't know, but one thing is clear. Historically, those diagnostic criteria were based mostly on observations of boys.
Oh, wow.
And so a lot of girls and women were just missed completely.
So they could be struggling, but because they don't fit that kind of stereotypical image of autism, no one knows.
Exactly. They might be internalizing their challenges or masking more effectively, or their special interests might align more with what's considered typical for girls.
Right, right.
And so they just fly under the radar.
It makes you wonder how many people are out there struggling and they don't even realize they're on the spectrum.
Absolutely. And I think that brings us to another really important point, which is sensory experiences.
Okay.
Because a lot of your sources really delved into how differently autistic people can experience sensory input.
Yeah, and that blog post I mentioned earlier, the one about the escalators,
Right.
that really brought it to life for me.
It's a perfect example. And it's not just about the 5 basic senses.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's also about things like proprioception.
Perfectly loud.
Proprioception, that's the sense of where your body is in space.
Okay.
And interoception, that's the awareness of like internal sensations, like hunger or heartbeat.
Yeah.
And for someone on the spectrum, these sensations can be super intense or even painful.
So something like a flickering fluorescent light or the feeling of a tag in their shirt, that could be like debilitating.
Exactly. And this can sometimes lead to what we call stimming.
Stimming.
Yeah, those repetitive movements or sounds that can actually help regulate those sensory experiences.
Yeah, and stimming, I think, is a great example of something that's often really misunderstood.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, people see it and they might think, oh, that's strange or that's disruptive, but it's actually a really important coping mechanism.
Yeah, one of those medical journals you sent, I was reading about that, and
Right.
it was explaining how stimming can actually help to filter out overwhelming sensory input or release pent-up energy.
Right.
It's almost like a pressure valve for the nervous system.
Exactly. And it can take so many different forms
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I was thinking it's like hand flapping or rocking back and forth.
Yeah, those are common ones, but it could also be things like fiddling with an object, humming a tune, or even like repeating a certain phrase.
Oh, so what might look like just a totally random behavior to me could
Mhm.
actually be someone's way of like managing their sensory experience.
Exactly. And sometimes that need to stim, it's heightened when people are dealing with co-occurring conditions, things like anxiety or depression. It's something I really wanted to talk about because I feel like there's this idea that autism is just like this standalone condition.
Yeah,
But so many of the sources you gave me, they emphasized how often it intersects with other mental health challenges.
it's a really good point. We can't just look at autism in isolation.
Right.
Imagine experiencing the world with like all these heightened sensory sensitivities, and struggling to navigate social situations, constantly feeling like you're on a different wavelength.
Yeah.
It's no wonder that anxiety and depression are so common.
This is like we're expecting people to manage all of that without acknowledging like the toll it takes.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important to look beyond just the autism diagnosis, and look at the whole person.
Right, the whole person.
Think about their individual needs, their support systems.
Well, speaking of support systems, you
Mhm.
gave me a lot of sources that talked about the challenges autistic people face in the workplace.
Oh, yeah. The workplace can be a really tough environment for a lot of people on the spectrum. Think about trying to concentrate in like a noisy open plan office with all these distractions or having to navigate all these unspoken social rules.
It's like we're designing these workplaces for neurotypical brains.
Right. And then there's the whole question of disclosure.
Should they tell their employer?
Exactly. Should they tell their employer they're autistic?
Right.
It's such a personal decision, but it's also a decision that comes with a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, I bet.
On the one hand, maybe if they disclose, they'll get more understanding and support.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's that fear of discrimination.
Oh, absolutely.
That fear is often justified, unfortunately.
Yeah.
We have a long way to go in terms of creating workplaces that truly celebrate neurodiversity.
But I guess it's not just about the physical environment or the employer's attitude.
No,
There's also the social aspect of work.
totally. I mean, even things like small talk, or nonverbal cues or office politics.
Yeah.
All that can be a minefield for someone on the spectrum.
Right. What might seem like just a casual conversation to one person could feel like a total interrogation to someone else.
Exactly. And that can be so exhausting. It can lead to burnout, social isolation.
It really makes you think about how much talent we're probably missing out on.
Yeah.
Just because we haven't created spaces where people who think differently can actually thrive.
It's a loss for everyone,
Absolutely.
not just the individuals, but society as a whole.
Because diversity isn't just about race or gender or anything like that.
Right.
It's about different ways of thinking and being in the world.
It absolutely is. And that brings us to another important area, which is relationships.
Yes, I was so into those personal stories from the blogs that you sent me.
Oh, yeah.
It was really interesting to see how autism can impact people's experiences with love, intimacy, and friendships.
It's so personal.
Yeah.
And I think it often comes back to that double empathy problem we talked about.
Yeah.
Autistic and non-autistic people might have different ways of expressing affection or reading social cues or communicating their needs.
So it's not that people on the spectrum don't want close relationships. It's
Right.
that they might need different ways of, you know,
Communicating?
communicating and understanding.
Exactly. Imagine someone who expresses love through acts of service rather than words.
Okay.
Or someone who needs really clear and direct communication instead of like subtle hints.
So it's kind of like learning each other's love languages.
Yeah.
And respecting the fact that they might be different.
Exactly. And that applies to all kinds of relationships too.
Right, like family.
Romantic partners, family, friends.
I remember in one of the blog posts, they talked about the importance of finding your people.
Yeah.
The people who really get you.
I love that it's so true, and it really speaks to the need for authentic connection. For a
Yes.
lot of autistic people, friendships with other people on the spectrum are so meaningful.
Right, because there's that shared understanding.
Yeah, that sense of belonging.
But it's not just about finding those safe spaces within the autistic community, right?
Right.
It's also about bridging that gap between the neurotypical world and the neurodivergent world.
Absolutely. And that's where I think education and awareness are so important. The
Mhm.
more we can help people understand what life is really like on the spectrum, the better we'll be able to create a more inclusive and accepting society.
Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to talk about something that we've kind of touched on throughout our conversation,
Okay.
and that is all those amazing strengths and talents that are often overlooked when we talk about autism.
It's true. We focus so much on the challenges. We
Ah.
forget about the incredible gifts that autistic people bring to the table. We hear so much about the challenges, but we forget about, the talents.
Yeah.
Your sources had so many stories of autistic people who are just excelling in all these different
Yeah,
fields.
like tech and
Yes,
science.
arts.
There was this article about an autistic programmer who developed this app
Oh,
to help people with sensory overload navigate public spaces.
wow.
I was like, this is genius.
It's incredible, and it's a perfect example of how neurodiversity can be such a strength.
Yeah.
This programmer's deep understanding of sensory experiences allowed them to create something that's really helping others.
And that's what we need to remember, right? We need to move away from this idea of fixing or curing autism
Totally.
and start celebrating the fact that brains just work differently.
I love that. Yeah, imagine if we could create these spaces where neurodivergent people could just thrive.
Yeah.
If we really valued their unique perspectives and
Yeah.
created environments that actually supported their needs.
Well, I think about all the amazing things that have been achieved by people on the spectrum,
Oh, yeah.
from like scientific discoveries to works of art.
Totally.
The world's a richer place because of those contributions.
It is, and yet, we still have so far to go to create a truly inclusive society,
Mhm.
a society that values neurodiversity not just in theory, but like actually in practice.
And I keep thinking back to those blog posts we were talking about,
Yeah.
the challenges that people face in the workplace, in
Mm.
relationships, and just like everyday life.
Yeah.
There's still so much stigma,
There is.
so much misunderstanding.
Yeah. And that's where I think we as individuals have a role to play.
Okay.
We can start by educating ourselves,
Yeah.
listening to autistic voices,
Mhm.
challenging those assumptions that we all have about what's normal.
One thing that really stood out to me in those personal accounts was just this feeling of isolation.
Ah, yeah.
Like they're always trying to fit into a world that wasn't really built for them.
That's got to be so hard.
Yeah. And it really made me think we need to be more aware, more compassionate.
Definitely.
Like even simple things like
Yeah.
being patient with someone who might need a little extra time to process information,
Yeah.
or just being mindful of the language that we use and the assumptions that we make.
Absolutely. And advocating for more inclusive policies
Yeah.
in schools,
In a workplace.
making sure that neurodivergent people have the support that they need to thrive.
I love that idea, moving beyond awareness to action,
Yeah.
creating a world where everyone feels seen and heard and valued.
Regardless of how their brain works.
Yeah, exactly.
And recognizing that neurodiversity is not a burden, it's a gift.
It really is.
It enriches our society in so many ways if we just open our minds to it.
Well, this deep dive has been so eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
I feel like I have a whole new understanding of the spectrum, not just the labels, but like the lived experiences,
Right.
the challenges, and also the triumphs.
The possibilities.
And there's just so much potential within the autistic community.
I think that's the power of these deep dives,
Yeah.
going beyond the surface, challenging our assumptions, and really embracing the complexity, the beauty of the human experience.
So to our listener, we hope this has been as thought-provoking for you as it has been for us.
We hope you keep exploring, keep learning,
Yeah. Keep challenging yourself to see the world a little differently.
because the more we understand about neurodiversity, the more we understand about ourselves.
And the more we understand about the potential that exists in each and every one of us.
Well said. Thank you for joining us.
See you next time for another deep dive.